to the Daily Objective, and today we are in Washington, D.C. at the Objectivist Conference, and excitedly going to look back at the history of the conferences and events surrounding this philosophy. Please hit that like button, hit the join button, and super chat us. You know, a lot of people have been approaching us, the TDO team, saying, oh, we love the show. And I say, oh, really? That's interesting. I haven't seen you in the super chat. And then I spit on the ground and walk away. So don't let that happen to you. I'm joking, of course. Let's meet our people on the panel today. Of course, we got the co-host extraordinaire, Don Watkins. Psychologist and relationship expert, Ellen Kenner. And a longtime objectivist event attendee and Texas resident, Stephen Rogers. Let's start with Stephen. Is there something about you that you like? Something I missed that I didn't, like a career, like she's a psychologist or...
Yeah, I spent a lot of time under various employers, but generally in the computer science field.
Okay, cool.
Software engineering, so I'm one of those objectivist software people.
And you've been coming to these events for a long time. When was the first time you made contact with objectivists at an event like this one?
I think my first conference was a conference that dates back to the 80s called the Thomas Jefferson School. Like, we commonly just refer to it by the acronym TJS. And I was at TJS 87, and it was on the campus of UCSD in California, and it was a really nice setup where we stayed in the dorms, and across the hall from me was Ellen and Harris. That's where I met them.
Amazing.
And
wow,
it's been just sort of a journey since then.
How long were the TJS conferences? Because OCONs, I mean, they used to be 2 weeks, now they're about a week. What was Thomas Jefferson?
The TJS was a solid 2 weeks of activity, which was, I don't, looking back, know how I actually did that. You know, I saved my vacation for a whole year, you know, and my wife and I at the time, you basically have to build your whole, your whole vacation schedule for a year around that. But it was really nice. You really sort of settle into the environment and get a real feel for a community at a 2-week event like that.
That sounds amazing. And you met Ellen. So Ellen, did you start attending the conference around that same time in the 1980s?
We went to the very first conference in the early 1980s, was it? 1983. Thank you.
83.
Buzz puppies out in the audience. 1983, and it was, I want to say, dreamy. It was just so incredible to be in a world with objectivists everywhere, that when we finally left that conference and got to the airport, there was an incredible letdown and sadness. And we kept, at the first airport, we would see some people that we knew, and saying goodbye to them. They were going on different planes. And then it got so sad as we left. It was like our worlds for 2 weeks. And we were able to add one more detail. They hired a van. So we were all in these like graduate center enclaves. We'd have our own apartments. And then there was always a van that circled around. So you could take that van to different places in La Jolla, including Black's Beach, which was a nude beach. No, I think you had to walk there. But.
So was it always in Southern California back then?
Well, it changed over the years. It went to Tammerman. Tammerman's one of my favorite. Nort Buchner ran that conference. I'm not sure if he did it with somebody else, and I'm shortchanging them. But that was at an incredible resort. That was more like being at campgrounds. You could, between lectures, you could go out and go on a paddle boat right in front of you. You could go swimming at the pool.
Oh, I don't want my lecture staff to compete with a paddle boat.
No, it was very conducive to, it gave you the environment of leisure plus incredible intellectual content.
Mm-hmm. So Ayn Rand, I think, passed away in 1982. And then 1983 sounds like was that the first conference? Is it that Rand didn't really want there to be a
Well, there
movement?
was a precursor. Like
There was?
I don't think it was anything like what we think of as objectivist conferences, but if you go over to an exhibit that our archives has set up, the first actual objectivist conference where there were lecturers and people gathering over time was in 1967, actually, and Leonard Peikoff was one of the lecturers. And I was trying to get one of the people from the archives in to talk about it, but they're all there hosting, the archives exhibit. But the modern conferences as we know them started in the 80s.
Right, and that was focused on the draft, I think, at that time, the early one.
That makes sense.
So the military draft was an issue that inspired people to galvanize and.
The first one, which we don't know about.
Okay.
But 1983, it was more generic. It was people from all over the country, world, assembling in one location and having activities together and being in a beautiful location. And we had to walk miles, though, to get to classes.
Miles?
No, not miles.
It felt like miles.
It felt like miles.
It
They
was
were
a
in different buildings. It wasn't in one
A big,
hotel.
beautiful campus. Yeah.
I think though, when we finally figured out that lesson was my first conference actually. So my first conference was in 2004 in Wintergreen,
Oh, that
Virginia.
was beautiful.
It was beautiful, except everything was in these spread out cabins all over, which made it really, you had to go like walk long distances everywhere. But also, there was not really, as far as I knew, places to congregate very easily. And so my experience was I showed up knowing 2 objectivists and I left knowing 3. And that is not how OCON is now designed to really help engage, give you
Right.
every ability to meet new people and get involved and get engaged. It was not not necessarily like it back then.
So I'm wondering if having an objectivist movement is sort of controversial in the first place. So I'm unclear on what Ayn Rand actually wanted. And obviously, once Ayn Rand is passed away, then it's our philosophy to do what we will with it and all that. But I don't know. Is it a coincidence that the 83, the year after Rand passed away, is when the objectivists started meeting? Is it that Rand wouldn't have approved of it, do you think, or do you not know? Don, maybe you're kind of an expert on the history a little bit, or no?
Well, I don't know the historical reasons, but I would make an important distinction between a movement and a community.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think the conferences are mainly about, though it speaks to the movement as well, and it's kind of where we come together to talk about what we're doing and share our new knowledge. I think it's fundamentally about community. It's about us spending time together, getting to know each other. And I think Ayn Rand would have approved of a community of objectivists, even if she didn't think there's a movement that's actively seeking cultural change in a unified sort of way.
Mm-hmm. And what did she think of a movement?
She thought it was premature
Okay.
in her lifetime, and I think she didn't want the responsibility for policing it
Mm-hmm.
and all of the things that go with it. And there had been the Nathaniel Branden Institute that was in effect trying to create a movement and a community, and she thought it went wrong in various ways. And I think she did not want to try to make it go right, and she wouldn't have delegated that to somebody else, right?
Mm-hmm. So in 83 and onwards, I'm picturing like young, Peter Schwartz and Harry Binswanger and Leonard Peikoff and all these,
Yeah.
all these greats, with an afro and sideburns, who knows, bell bottoms. And
got those out today.
and they would get up and they would speak. They would give lectures, not dissimilar to what we would hear these days, but with maybe a different style, different level of integration. They were still starting to mull over this philosophy that now everyone's had, many more decades to mull over. What do you remember? What do you two remember from those lectures back then?
It's hard to remember a lot of the specifics, but because it's hard to remember, I do have a website called objectivistmedia.com, and if you're interested in digging back into that, it lists all the conferences that I could find, from in part by digging through the archives, and some, ones that Harry's told me about, the very early ones I hadn't even heard of before until a few years ago.
Is the media on the website, like videos, recordings, or no?
Points into the lectures, the titles of the lectures and who gave them are on the website, and then there are pointers into the AynRand.org and the ARU, where on the Ayn Rand campus, where those you can find those lectures online. So it's
Yeah.
it's a way to, if you're curious about, what happened way back when. There are a few pictures in there because the group photo has been a tradition all the
Those look
way
cool,
back to
yeah.
TJS. Yeah, so there's pictures of the sideburned and bell-bottom people in their
Right. So
check blazers.
probably some of the greatest hits, like Harry Binswanger on epistemology or whatever, is still out there and being promoted by ARI, was probably you might have been seeing those in person.
We saw OPAR develop.
And you're asking some questions now that it's coming back to me. I've heard you ask Leonard Peikoff and Harry Binswanger and others questions.
I asked Ayn Rand questions.
Oh,
but
dear.
that was not at
That was not at OCON, so we're
that
not
was
talking
her
about
last photo forum. Yeah.
Okay, before we jump back to 83 and the 80s, can I ask you, what did you ask Ayn Rand?
I asked her two questions. I was next to the last person led into there's a whole story of me going there, but I asked her, I was way up in the balcony, I asked her, how would she raise children in today's culture? And essentially she said, even though that's not her field, that the development of the child's mind is best done by a woman, Maria Montessori. She pointed me to Montessori. And the other is, I asked her if she would ever write her autobiography. Anyone want to take a stab at an answer?
An emphatic no.
Yeah.
It would bore me.
Yeah.
It would bore me.
Yeah.
Well, it wouldn't bore me.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
those were the two questions. But
And are those on the recordings of the Ford home?
yeah,
Oh,
I had
okay.
to go back to remember what I
Yeah.
asked her.
Amazing. Wow, that must have been amazing. But
Yeah,
okay,
that was amazing.
back to the 80s now. And you were asking the philosophers and the intellectuals questions and stuff like that. That must have been a real treat.
Oh, you had access to people like Ed Locke. You had access to Leonard Peikoff. We have the little blue books, any of us who attended the OPAR, I'm looking in the audience for people I know that attended many of the conferences, OPAR books, the initial ones, like the first, I think they were set in
Yeah,
two
no, I've
chapters,
seen them.
two sets.
Right.
And he wanted feedback on OPAR. To give him feedback. Did he get anything wrong? Do we have any ideas? Or he was very open. That was nice. And Ed Locke's lecture on happiness was amazing. And I launched my career from OCONs.
Wow.
From the early ones.
You co-authored with Ed Locke.
No, that's much later.
That's much later.
on.
Okay. So now OPAR came out in the early 90s, like 91 or so. So let's go into the 1990s. Did anything change at this point? Was there more people learning about Ayn Rand and attending these events? Was the structure of it different? Were you still crossing from building to building and stuff like that? Or was the game getting tighter, if you recall? Can you differentiate the 90s from the 80s?
More
Sure.
hotels, yeah.
More
but
hotels.
Well, what point did
But-
it shift from TJS? Then there was Lyceum, Second
Oh, no,
Renaissance.
but before you had Nort's conference, because TJS started, Thomas Jefferson School, and then Nort decided, they were only doing it every other year in California. Nort Buchner wanted to do it on the East Coast, and so he had a conference there, Tammerman.
And thus began the
And
tradition
then they
of
started going
alternating
back and
coasts.
forth, and one
All right.
year they had them on both coasts. And what I found fascinating, and then I'll pass it to you, was that I've traveled all over this country to places I never would have gone to on my own through these conferences. And at early on, you didn't have the social media, so you couldn't just go on the web and listen to the same lecture. You had to be there in person to get that information. And my notes were copious. I think I developed carpal tunnel from taking notes. I don't have it anymore, but just, I wanted to get every word. And the Q&As after Leonard's classes, everyone would pile in. But we really traveled. We've been to Florida. We've been to Colorado. Tim, Ray, you want to throw in some places?
The place in Virginia,
Wintergreen.
Wintergreen, yeah. Ouray, did you mention that one?
Ouray, which is the original Atlantis. We got to go. That was, yeah.
Amazing. So there was this real sense of like us, like versus the world, or like it's like most people aren't familiar with our context. Like I know there was a trip to Greece at one point. So there, and you mentioned, Ellen, like when the conference was over, it was sad, not only because you're saying goodbye for now, but like you're like re-entering the world out there. I imagine with the level of communication back then, it really did feel like kind of lonely to be into objectivism in a way that's not really the case anymore.
Huh.
What do you think of that?
I, go ahead, you go first,
No, go
because
ahead.
I've been talking.
Yeah, I think that maybe, maybe not lonely is the right word, but at least there's a sense in which you feel like, there's something you're interested in, or, something that you care about, that's important, not just like, oh, I'm a stamp collector, and not many people do that, but something really important to yourself that's not shared by other people. But I think part of it too is I know Yaron talks about this a lot, the sense of, there's a certain sense of community because Harry and some other people had the wise idea of instead of just selling the lectures, they would circulate the tapes, and people would organize lectures, kind of like the Tupperware party. A person would be a host, and you'd go to their house and listen. Everyone would listen to the tapes,
Yeah.
and that provided a way that bootstrapped a lot of communities. That really bootstrapped the community in Austin, because we had a community of 30 or 40 people who would come and go around these listening to the lectures. And you would gather and listen to them in person, and that really I think that really offset any sense that you would have of like it's sort of lonely being an objectivist.
Mm-hmm. I imagine it's a trip, and I mean, people around today can still get sort of a taste of this, where like you read Rand and it's life changing, and then like anyone who has anything to do with Ayn Rand seems like a god among men, but then you start going to these events, and before you know it, you're personal friends with some of these people, and I imagine back then, especially, you were staying at each other's apartments, like just really roughing it at times, and working on projects together because of how much smaller the whole scene kind of was. So there must have been kind of a surreal element to it, if I had to guess.
I would say that it gave me a sense of not, it was lonely leaving, obviously, just like when I leave my kids, or the kids leave me as grown-ups, you feel that. But there's a sense of continuity. You know that it's going on into the future. You know that there'll be another conference, even if it's in 2 years. And you still would get information through newsletters that there, or some sort of, this was pre-social media, but you would get information that something incredible happened. There was an ad in the New York Times that about the Russian attack written by an objectivist, and it would be one thing every few months, every year sometimes, And now we're inundated with it. It's so much, nobody can read all the books that are coming out from objectivists. I haven't read yours yet. But,
Which one?
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I've read your first ones, and I promoted them, and I bought tons of them.
Very,
Yeah.
very different.
Yeah, I did buy a lot. So, but there's so much material now. So I felt it more as a sense of connection, even if you don't see each other for a while. Like your kids going off to college, they call you every once in a while, and there's that continuity. And we had friends like Godfrey. Godfrey I miss tremendously here, but I've already emailed him. But friends that you made here during that 2-week period, because you could develop friendships and funny stories, and that was really neat.
You and Harris and Godfrey are the
4 of us. There are 4 people who attended every single summer conference up until last year, when Godfrey backed out because it was hard to get here from Europe with COVID, and Harris and I backed out last minute when we got an email from Anu saying it's at level 5 and you won't get a hospital bed. COVID is at level 5. So we missed last year, but I saw the whole thing. I never missed it. I saw more than I normally see because I saw every class.
Wow.
Even the ones that
You really you missed some great Texas weather, I'll tell you that.
I missed the camaraderie. It looked like an incredible experience.
So in the 1990s, was there kind of a change in like the scene, the content? I imagine there were some new faces starting to show up, maybe like a young Greg Salmieri and others.
Yeah.
showing up, and like Elon, you know, they're showing up. They've got the backwards cap and, you know, and the high top sneakers, and are they are people talking about things like maybe more psychology and sociological stuff, or just psychology, let's say, as opposed to previously when it was maybe mostly philosophy? I'm just kind of throwing these ideas out there, seeing if any of it is the case. Like maybe the content started to change in the 90s, you think?
Well, I mean, the original TJSs, though, you had an economist and a psychologist who ran it, and so like they were giving a lot of the lectures too.
And Ed Locke.
But it's certainly become, I think, more diverse as we see. I mean, now we have experts, like top intellectual experts in every field you could ever want to hear about. So I think, you know, the hard problem is not like how are we going to get great content for OCON, but how many people are we going to have to turn down?
Right, and how do you
That's the
turn them
challenge.
down without discouraging them for a future year?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, we had, and the Edith Packer and George Reisman, who ran the first conferences, would bring in usually one outside person, like Edward Teller, or who's the guy that designed the Petri dish? He was fascinating. They were not objectivists, but they'd bring one outside person in a year. Just maybe it was for them, they were interesting people. Yeah, Walter Williams.
Walter
He wasn't the
Williams,
one that
yes.
designed the Petri dish. That was the one. Instead of having to do cancer research with rats, he designed a Petri dish where you could do cancer research and grow the cells and see if cancer was there. And he was fascinating. I remember content, but I can't get his name right now. What he would do, he said a lot of the people who were vegetarian, vegans, or this whole, and he would go in and take stressed celery and put it into the Petri dish and show them that it had more parts per billion or million, however they counted, of carcinogens. Their stressed celery, old celery, makes me think twice when I eat celery, than what they're getting from smokestacks. It's not just vegetarian. It was like all of the anti-industrial movements that were around, you know, so that was a fascinating story. And Walter Williams was great. He said, what does it say about, I just picture him very calmly saying, you know, we have Black leaders. Where are the white leaders? Where are the Indian leaders? And I'm paraphrasing, but why do we need leaders? And it was such a great moment. Like, we don't need leaders. We're individuals.
Yeah, for those people who don't know, Walter Williams was a Black economist who was friendly with Thomas Sowell, very close friends, and shared a lot of the same views, particularly that the way race was thought about and talked about was very, very collectivist and wrong.
Mm-hmm. Individualism is powerful when it's presented by someone who's a part of a minority group, you know, whether we like it or not. And that, you know, that was very powerful. That's pretty amazing that Walter Williams used to hang around the objectivists.
No, he was invited.
He was
to
invited,
come into
okay.
one lecture.
Still,
They would, yeah.
Mhm. Very cool. Okay, before we exit out of the 90s, a couple super chats that relate. Kathleen has become a member. Jonathan Honig sent $19.99 and says, in honor of Ellen. It's $19.99, so that's appropriate for exiting the 90s. And now Bonnie asks, was Dr. Peikoff a regular speaker?
Yes. Yes.
Pretty straightforward.
Wouldn't be a conference. Yeah, that's the lecture we were hanging on every word of. Yeah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
I always get disappointed when I pop on one of the lectures and it's one of the rare ones where it's like in the morning.
Mm-hmm. Good
You're
morning.
like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
Where's the greeting?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it must have been. And Jonathan says, buy Ellen's book in the super chat. Thank you, Jonathan.
And with Ed Locke.
And with Ed Locke, please. It's The Selfish Path to Romance.
Yeah.
Who doesn't need that, or who doesn't want it? The feeling after Ayn Rand passed away must have been a little bit like, wow, like, is this thing gonna live on without her? And then the answer is like, yes, we're gonna make it. We're gonna keep this going. And then so Leonard Peikoff retired at some point, or he just kind of like withdrew from the scene. It must have felt, well, I guess I shouldn't even ask you. I don't even need to ask this because I'm old enough at this point to kind of to have noticed him retiring. And that was like in the mid 2000s, late 2000s that Leonard Peikoff sort of withdrew from the scene.
I mean, the last official OCON like lecture, like in the traditional, lecture style, was he did lectures on his dim book. I think the last one was at Telluride, if I remember correctly. Or no, I think there was one more, maybe in Newport. But you never know with Leonard. He's been giving last lectures for the last 10 years. So.
Yeah, he even lectured recently, right, about operetta. But okay, so in the 2000s, would you say there's anything distinguishing different? I know at this point the Ayn Rand Institute has a young Yaron Brook, and this guy, he's giving interviews. He's like turning objectivism into a household name.
Well, the most important thing for the conferences. This is when ARI took over the conferences. Was in the early 2000s. I think 2003, maybe 2002. Something like that.
And the decade is largely focused on foreign policy for obvious reasons, and a lot of objectivists were writing and lecturing on that. I imagine a lot of the lectures at the conference had to do with foreign policy, perhaps, maybe on the Patriot Act as well. I'm guessing, if you recall.
It came up.
It came up.
Yeah, but you also had at the same time, like this was when Leonard was doing his path-breaking stuff on induction, and so I mean it was. The philosophy was as rich as ever, and there's a lot of exciting, things. I mean, I didn't really start going consistently until 2006, so I have a better sense of after that. But definitely it was still philosophically rich, though hopefully we were tackling the issue of the day as well.
The language might have gotten softer, do you think? Do you think objectivists by into the 2000s were starting to use more of like personable tone, leading us to the present era that those of us here are familiar with? Because you listen to old lectures and not everything, shouldn't exaggerate, but like there was kind of an epic quality to objectivist like presentation a lot of the time, I think.
I think passion is good. I think that one of the things that I've seen soften over the years in a very good sense is persuasion. This is your field too, but persuasion has gotten much more reasonable. I think when any of us first read Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead and were introduced, it's like you want to change the world. And you can use it almost as, but you've got to understand this. You don't realize how the process of change works. It happens over time, and people have to tangle with their own current ideas that they have. And I think that there's much more understanding that you need to reach a person's mind. You can't force the information in. So I know in one course that I gave, I talked about don't use objectivism as a battering ram. Like I know better than you or something.
I wouldn't exactly put it as soften though. I think it's, so Greg Salmieri gave an amazing lecture on reproduction and and how to think about it from an objectivist perspective. And today, in the Q&A, he pointed out one of the things that happens from generations interacting is that stuff that took Harry Binswanger a decade to figure out is now something that you get very early, and so you can kind of get clearer faster. And if you just think, OPARD, like you said, didn't exist till the 90s, and so what has happened is it's so much easier to learn objectivism because of the generations that have come before, that now somebody like me can start thinking about something like persuasion full-time instead of spending 30 years like Leonard Peikoff did, just getting what the heck Ayn Rand's talking about. And so I think part of what you see is that we can kind of zero in on, all right, what's the best way in which to actually communicate these ideas effectively to others, because the kind of acceleration on just how do you learn what this set of ideas is.
Right. And what are the expectations on their part? If they don't say, oh yeah, right away, they need to mull it over. They need to let the ideas percolate and integrate it and come up against the current ideas that they're holding and have an internal debate.
Yeah.
So you have more understanding that it takes time for people to process the ideas. It takes time for me, for all of us.
And I do think, I mean, one thing that I do think happened is understandably, like Ayn Rand's way of communicating became kind of the model. And this is how we do things. And then Leonard, as a lecturer, established like this is how I do things. And those things kind of got modeled by people naturally. But the cultural context changed. Like what is compelling to people in like 1968? The same ideas can be compelling today, but it might not necessarily address the cultural context, or it might be too formal. So I do think you see less formality sometimes at OCON, part of like the changing of the culture. So I think there were those kinds of shifts.
Yeah, and I tend to think like the more normal objectivists look, like normal in a good sense, doesn't mean objectivists parrot everything that we hear in the culture, but just like if objectivists are like approachable and personable, then that's a sign of like being grounded and integrated and not being like kind of nutty and detached from reality. Then that's not to say, well, maybe it is to say that in the past the objectivist scene had more kind of weirdos. Um,
I think we worked hard to drive as many of those people out as possible, and there's always been really healthy attitude towards objectivism, right? Like the people who are in this room now who've been here many years, like they were there back in the day, but you've got your share of weirdos, and I think we've worked. How do we make the movement as healthy as possible? Because yeah, you're right. At the end of the day, you can't say to somebody, "Hey, let me tell you how to live," and then they look at you and go, "You mean like you?" Like, you as a person have to be appealing if you're going to be persuasive, providing philosophic and moral guidance.
Yeah, all right. So in the 2000s, I see that as kind of like a golden era in a way, because like you still had the best of the older generation and so all this new talent like Yaron Brook and all these people were like starting to speak as well. Ellen, when did you go from audience member to speaker? What do you remember?
Very early
Oh.
on. We went the early 90s, I think,
Mhm.
1993 maybe. We went to a conference, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I asked I said, no, I did know. I wanted to go into philosophy. Edith Packer said no, psychology. And I spoke to Mike Berliner, and he said no, psychology. They both gave one reason. Anyone want to take a guess?
You like people?
Well, psychology is applied philosophy.
No. Yeah.
It's that I'll be able to, and I could focus on objectivism. I wouldn't have to learn about all those wackos, which you do anyway when you study objectivism, the history of philosophy. But I don't mean philosophers, obviously. Objectivist philosophers are good ones. But, and then, and the first conference, one of the first conferences, Edith wanted everyone to have a PhD. And she just approached me and said, if you get your PhD in 2 years, I did go into philosophy by that time, I'd like you to teach a course. Could you write me a description of what you would like to do tonight and give it to me tomorrow? I was like, really? It was such a dramatic change, because I'm thinking someday in the future, meaning 20 years, I would lecture. So I wrote her something, and that's how it began. And then I did it. She invited me again, and then Pam Benson was sitting in the audience, and Pam Benson invited, and Yaron, when they started Lyceum, they invited me to speak at conferences.
Oh wow.
That's
So
how it took off.
so that was pretty early. So then in the
That was
in the
early, yeah.
2000s, you had a lot of new talent coming in, still a lot of the energy from the older generation, and I imagine there was a little bit of a conflict about politics, as there tends to be. You know, more recently, some people who are into objectivism feel that the objectivists are too anti-Trump, let's say. I imagine 15 years ago, a lot of objectivists or people who call themselves objectivists were pro-Bush. They thought George Bush was like doing great work, and they were furious that like Yaron Brook and others voted against Bush, and maybe with Ron Paul as well. Like, how could you not be into Ron Paul? He's everything we wanted, right? So I don't know if this is a question. This is just kind of like some thoughts I've had about some of the inner fighting that's probably gone on over the last 20 years. But yeah, then the most recent decade comes around, and anything stand out about this last 10, 12 years since around 2010. I know there's been more of a focus on bringing in students, like college students. That seems to be kind of a mark. There was the Objectivist Movement 2.0 experiment that was kind of a rebranding that was going on for a short while. I think the idea again is to
I
like,
wouldn't even say a short while.
Oh.
I just re-listened to Ankar's talk on
Mhm.
Objectivism 2.0, and it's really about
Movement 2.0.
yeah. So right, thank you.
Yeah.
And it was really about how do we create a healthier, vibrant movement, and I've really seen a lot of that. I think we're seeing a lot of that come to fruition, and I think the part of what I was trying to capture in my contribution to Tal's State of ARI is Ayn Rand University. A big part of what you guys should be excited for is not just, okay, these are people helping to change the culture. It's going to enrich our culture, right? You mentioned like disagreements among objectivists. We're always going to have disagreements, but imagine if those disagreements are informed by people who have a much deeper grasp of the philosophy and a much better closer connection to good role models from a young age about what it means to understand and live by the philosophy and disagree with somebody respectfully and so on. I think it's going to make the community enormously more vibrant than it already is.
Yeah, without question, ARI is like using the internet, utilizing the internet in a major way. But a missed opportunity is that ARI or whoever, objectivists, could have used the internet from the start in a much more hands-on way, like YouTube. When YouTube first came around, imagine if an objectivist, like a bona fide objectivist, was on there every day, doing a 10-minute podcast. Because back then, 10-minute videos were all you could post. But just imagine how that could have grown. And I mean, hindsight, they say, what is 2020? Any other missed opportunities that come to mind, or comments on what I just said? That
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Like we were behind the time. I mean, I remember I was at ARI when we finally started we were ready to start an ARI blog, and this was just as blogging was on its way out, and video and podcasting was supposed to take over. So for a long time we were like on the opposite of the cutting edge. I mean, you probably were like tearing your hair out as somebody like on the cutting edge of technology, and the culture has radically shifted in the sense that I think we're much more keeping our eyes open to like, hey, we have access to these students who are using like the stuff that young people are using. Let's see if we can play around and find a way to really thrive here. So that I agree has changed.
Yeah, I don't think it's just us though in this movement, because I think a lot of political and ideological movements are still really struggling with what does the internet mean, and what do these new forms of communication really mean for like in terms of building communities and spreading ideas and getting people energized. So it's like you can definitely see a lot of missed opportunities there, but it's difficult.
blossoming.
It's a difficult thing to grasp, how this totally new world is going to apply. And I think we're doing it. I think, and that's in part
And
why things feel so different, like in the last 10 years.
I think the lockdowns, when everybody had to use the internet and everybody got more savvy and Zooming, and people realized they could be mobile, work from home, and they could live around the world. I think if anything, one of the silver linings to that, if you want to call it, is that it blossomed. But I've seen, and I'm sure you have too, the objectivist movement, just starting from Ayn Rand and that circle to branching out a little bit to the conferences. And then, like now, there are so many productive people. There are so many more ways of reaching out that it's just, it gives me the chills, not just because I took off my sweater, but it's wonderful to just think that there's an Ayn Rand University now. You're teaching at it, and your course looks wonderful, by the way. Everyone can take a look at the catalog.
Sign up today.
Yeah, there are just so many opportunities out there that, if anything, it's a wonderful overload. One last thing about the conferences, if I may. I know
Please.
you need to wrap up. Yaron and Tal, his wife Revital, had an art store that they would bring to the universities called Values. And some of the best artwork in our home is from work that they would bring in. It wasn't like Quent Cordier, the Cordiers, Linda and Quint have they've brought their gallery to different uh, um, conferences too, which is wonderful. It was the beginning of that, though, to bring art back into these conferences. And of course, there are a lot of activities too that people did even way back when that connected people a lot, whether it was a softball game way back when or poker nowadays.
Yeah, Ron and his wife were really a big force for that, I think, in the
Very
early
big
days in
force.
shaping the content of the conferences. Because we had conferences in Texas, a little local event for about 7 years from the late 80s to the early 90s. And that they really pulled a lot of art into that.
I was
Amazing.
to one.
And we do need to wrap, but I'll take us out on an optimistic note, even with errors that having been made. If the history of the United States has taught me one thing, it's that even just a little bit of good philosophy creates a culture that could withstand endless errors, mistakes, and catastrophes. So we're going to make it. And
Of course.
and here, let's go out with Super Chats. Chandler says, thank you for being a part of the groundwork of objectivism. Here's to the future of a movement. And Maria says, great episode. Thank you. And thank all of you. Be back here tomorrow, same time for the Daily Objective. Now let's go watch some Gina Gorlin talk about whatever it is she's going to talk about, and have a wonderful day.
Or a mazer.
And goodbye.